why are you hanging out in the middle of the street playing hide and seek? Like really shitty hide and seek. You're hiding behind a fucking tree and they can see you.
Welcome to Shat on TV Lovecraft Country, the unofficial podcast companion piece to the new HBO series, Lovecraft Country. I'm one of your hosts, Gene Lyons, and alongside me is my co-host, Ashley Schlafly.
Hi, y'all.
And this is our deep dive episode where we look back on this week's episode of Lovecraft Country and provide our thoughts and analysis, plus the top listener emails and voicemails for the week. This week's episode of Lovecraft Country was episode 4, A History of Violence. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the podcast to make sure you don't miss an episode. You can do that wherever you get your podcasts or by visiting shatontv.com/subscribe. Remember, we also have an instant reaction live stream every Sunday night on Twitch. You can find that at shatontv.com/Twitch. It airs immediately after Lovecraft Country. And thank you so much to everybody who's joined us and joined in that conversation. We have a great time every Sunday night, and it really helps propel us into the deep dive. Now, Ash, the topics we have for the deep dive were largely compiled from what the audience want to know about, and also things that we were more curious about. And now that we've had some time to research the episode 4, what stood out to you the most?
It's pretty clear by now that Misha Green and the other showrunners are doing a really good job of trying to prove lots of points and make some really clear messages to the audience in each episode. And it almost seems like, and I don't mean this in a derogatory way, but almost like an after school special to school all of us out there who are blind to the real world, right, of other people's experiences. And I find that to be really fascinating. Now, I don't know necessarily if the show itself is as strong as the messages that they're making, because I thought that this week the pacing was crazy quick again, but the messages are there, and I think it's worth watching no matter what, just to hear those messages and to be schooled by a pretty amazing group of television producers and writers and actors. And I will also say that the other thing that stood out to me this week is the continued literary references and pop culture references. I mean, clearly this episode was inspired by The Journey to the Center of the Earth. They make 3 different references to that book throughout the episode. And then from a pop culture perspective, you felt a ton of Indiana Jones, a ton of National Treasure, a ton of Da Vinci Code, and even a ton of the Goonies in there, and I think that's really charming. And finally, I think that the secondary character development that happened in this episode was super strong. And I am really looking forward to that, Hippolyta and Ruby specifically, where they go in the coming weeks, because after this one, I am #Team Ruby for the rest of the season. I'm obsessed with her, and I really enjoyed getting to see she and Hippolyta start to get some teeth to their characters, and thought it was pretty cool.
And Ash, anybody who's listened to this podcast for a couple episodes now understands that we will use this phrase, maybe the show wasn't written for us, right?
Mm-hmm.
You are a white woman. I am a Middle Eastern man who passes as white pretty easily and grew up in white culture. And so it is very easy for us to miss certain messages or not be the target audience for the show. And what I found, though, in the last few weeks is there might be a dual purpose to the show. It speaks very clearly to an audience made of people of color, but also it is, as you said, not in a derogatory sense, an after-school special for white people.
Mm-hmm.
Several listeners have written us and said, hey, I didn't know about sundown towns. Hey, I didn't know about all these other aspects of otherness. And now we're seeing them expressed in the show. So it's doing a fantastic job of that. For me, this episode really opened my eyes to museums. I've been a big fan of museums. I'm a super museum dork. I go to any museum and I read every single plaque in the place. I want to know everything about everything. And I've always heralded them as a bastion of knowledge and seeing the real thing. And this episode took us to a museum and turned that entire experience on its head. It was the perfect setting for the episode's title, A History of Violence, because we largely consider, what do you think about a museum? You got to be quiet. It's very educational. That's not necessarily the case. Museums of history largely are giant displays of looting. Shit that was stolen from one place and brought to you, Americans, to look at. And Lovecraft Country really brings this message to the forefront in a way that you can feel from this celebration of Titus Braithwaite. So we're introduced in episode 1 to what a horrible person he is. He is awful. He is brutal. He is a slave trader. He is the worst of the worst. And here we see he is being heralded on the surface level of this museum. And deep within the bowels of the museum are the people he exploited during and after his journeys. I thought it was brilliant. And again, we talk about what we can learn from these episodes. That's what I learned. So Ash and I have compiled a list of topics. Again, if you've never listened to the deep dive before, we go topic to topic rather than scene by scene. We will also get into who is pulling the strings behind the scenes between Christina and William. We'll also talk a little bit more about museums and looting. Also, why is Montrose going along with all this? And why does he do what he does at the end of the episode? Plus some odds and ends. And of course, several voicemails and email from the listeners. Ash, I am most excited to hear what you learned from this episode.
So I think one of the first things we wanted to chat about is this, pretty big reveal for Montrose here, which is that Montrose is a queer character. At least that's what we're left to insinuate from this episode. And for those of you that maybe didn't pick up on it, basically what happens is you've got Tree who hitches a ride with them, and Tree frequents the bar that Montrose frequents, Denmark Vessey's, which we've talked about in a previous episode. We know from the very first episode that the owner of Denmark Vessey's, Sammy, that he's in the back with, a male friend having a good time in the alleyway. And so with all of that in mind, it is very heavily implied to Tick by Tree that Montrose is also gay. And I think that this is a really important piece because I'm excited to see them explore another aspect of otherness on the show, which is sexual orientation. I'm super excited too, because I think it's going to give more context to Montrose and Tick's character, because clearly Tick does not react in a very accepting way from the get-go. He's shocked by it. I don't think he'd ever thought that before. And it's also going to make this whole backstory with Dee, his wife, and George and Dee having an affair. I think it's going to complicate all of those things and make it very rich, just like real life, right? Like in real life, relationships are never simple, and there's always reasons why relationships fall apart or relationships don't quite work the way that you think they should traditionally, in terms of like this father-son dynamic, right? There's not a lot of love there that's being shown between them. And so I think that this is an interesting dynamic, and thought it was a pretty great reveal, actually.
And Ash, I love that you use the term queer, because with respect to Montrose, with respect to Sammy, who owns Denmark Vessey's, we're not clear as to any sort of binary sexual orientation, right? Or sexual identity. And I think it's wonderful that the show has that degree of maturity. Like you said, that is, there's no clear-cut lines here. It's saying that people make choices, people have their own sexuality. And we also see that possibly with this dual character of Christina and William, the way sexuality sits, it's on a spectrum. Maybe not even a spectrum. It's in a diaspora rather than a simple checkbox.
Absolutely. And Montrose already is so complex. I'm excited to see a part that humanizes him, because up until this point, he's been very hard of a character. And so I'm interested to get into his own backstory and the struggles he's experienced as well. And that leads me to Ruby. So I joked in the opening that I'm hashtag Team Ruby, and I am, because Ruby, we find out in this episode, if we weren't quite clear yet, that she is a badass bitch. She's amazing. And so we find out that she and Leti have the foul mouth in common. That's very out of time for their characters. I love the moment where she looks at the audience. He says, well, fuck you too. When they don't applaud her, then they're completely ungrateful for a performance that was amazing and a dress that was even more spectacular. And I think that we really began to see some of the intense struggles that Ruby has had in her life in this episode. We saw the scene in the department store, which I thought was just heartbreaking, when she walks in and she sees this tiny skin skinny, really, beautiful woman of color that's gotten this job. And while Ruby is beautiful, she's not like this thin little waif of a woman. She is a woman. Like, she is thick and curvy and doesn't look like Leti and doesn't look like this woman that's been hired by the department store. And then you see her in the bar, and then you see her reaction to William. And I just thought all of it was great. And I also love that she threw this good girl, I'm going to be responsible all the time, image, that she threw it kind of to the side to go after what she wanted. And she, has sex on the stairs with a way too blonde guy with a demon tat on his chest. And I thought it was fantastic. I really liked her development, and I love how complex of a character she's becoming.
And a credit to the direction and the cinematography of this episode, Ash. Looking at her in that bar, you understand. And it is rare that TV takes a character who is built and looks like Ruby and says, yes, this is sexy. And she looked fucking amazing. Like you said, I mean, she is radiating sexuality in that scene. And I fucking loved that they decided to shoot the scene in that way.
Well, and then in the episode, we do finally get to meet another part of the Order of the Ancient Dawn. We find out that this terrible police officer who just horribly abused Leti in the last episode, that they are all involved with this order. And I think that what's important about this is that it creates this extra layer of danger for the police force and for Christina, because Christina knew what was going to happen to Leti and her other friends and family that moved into this house. And it just shows another way that she has no sympathy for them, that they're pawns, because she's making fun of them for having people of color move into this house in their neighborhood. She knows it's going to piss off these police officers. And so yet again, they being Leti and her family and friends, they are being used again as a pawn by Christina in a really exploitative way and a dangerous way.
And we spoke in the preview and episode 1 about the attention to detail with the settings of this show. In particular, the backdrops having lush, living, breathing environments, as the King Bee said. I appreciate that they give little hints of where you are based on the decor and the overall ambiance of particular scenes. I appreciate that the Chicago Order has different personnel and facilities that reflect the region and the attitude, right? It's cops in one scene, whereas it's like bizarre, affluent wizard dudes in the other. The Chicago Lodge is exactly as I imagined it, and it reflects a more modern, more integrated, more progressive wing of the order. They might be more pragmatists than ritualists.
Well, and speaking of the Order, we learn more about Titus this week, the Order's founder. We find out that he, quote unquote, was in the shipping business, aka slave trader. And he, quote unquote, spread the ways of the white man to other places, cue genocide and horrible, atrocities that he probably inflicted on everywhere he went. And so I think it just confirms what we already knew, which is that he's just the absolute worst of the worst. And a lot of people are talking about how his statue in the museum looked just like Columbus, and it did. And I think it's perfect, because fuck Columbus. And, he was a terrible person. Columbus was horrible. And so having Titus be, this fictional version of an explorer, much like Columbus, I think was perfect, and it was clever, and it let us know immediately, okay, this is what we're dealing with. This guy was bad fucking news. And then the final, what we learned, and obviously, guys, we learned a lot more than just these few things, but the other thing that we thought was really important to start this conversation off with is that clearly Hiram knew about this tunnel that ran from apparently Boston to Chicago in some magical way. And
right.
So
20 yards, yes.
The show moves fast. And so there's details that can be easily missed. So if you missed it, when they finally get to Titus's vault, that elevator that they see is the elevator in Leti's house. So Hiram clearly was able to create some sort of spell that lowered that elevator into another dimension. I mean, we don't really understand the properties of where they are, but lowered it there and was doing some sort of experimenting, right? Because somebody had their arm cut off. Hiram was getting very close to figuring out what was going on and how to get into this vault. And I think this also adds another layer of the supernatural to Leti's house, because it not only is haunted because of these horrible experiments that Hiram is doing or was doing, but also that it's built over some portal from Boston to Chicago with a vault with trapped indigenous people inside of it for all eternity. So, I mean, I can't think that that would be good for your living experience at all. So maybe another exorcism will be coming sometime soon.
And although these episodes might feel disjointed or not connected, what Ash said makes a lot of sense when you consider all of it is driven by the Braithwaites. It goes back to Christina, right? So if you think about everything that's happened so far, although it appears that characters have some degree of autonomy, that they're doing things in their own best interest, it really comes back to what Christina wants. Think about it. Christina Braithwaite takes her father and the rest of the order out in Artem, right? And she uses Atticus as a Trojan horse, as he explains it, to do so. She presented Atticus as a gift on a platter to her father, but in fact, it was a trap. Now, Christina, after wiping out the order at Artem, she wants three things that can increase her power. She wants the Book of Names, she wants the lost pages from the Book of Names, and she wants the orrery. And the orrery is like that solar system model that we see in this episode. And she's actively using the other characters to get what she wants. So we see her visit Letitia. She's cruising over to Rihanna, and she gets to the house, and she's like, I want the orrery. And Letitia's like, fuck off. You don't own this house. My name is on the deed. Then we see later in the episode that who has the orrery? It's Hippolyta. So we can assume now the reason why Letitia got the funding for the house was ultimately that Christina wants this orrery, which she now cannot get. And what happens when she can't get it through Letitia? When Letitia rebuffs her advance to get it, she switches over to William to pick up Ruby. So if you didn't catch it, the scene that Ash referenced earlier in the pod was William approaching Ruby and essentially trying to seduce her, whether it be through money, power, sexuality, whatever he had to offer. That's William from the Artem house. He is attempting to get her because they need another inroads, right? They can't go through Letitia. That is a closed door. It's a dead end. I think that brings us, Ash, to a fair degree of confidence that Christina and William could be the same person.
Well, no, you've never seen them in the same room. I mean, it's very Clark Kent Superman, right? Like they've clearly never been in the same room. And I also think it's important too, because think about it. If you're Christina and your dad already gives you the invulnerability spell, right? So you have that. What kind of spell are you going to work on? If I'm her, I'm working on becoming a man, because that's the way I get more power in this world. And I think that she's smart enough to understand that, and she's smart enough to use that to her advantage.
And we get hints of that throughout this series, right? It's Christina and Atticus speaking at Artem, where Atticus says, you can't attend the dinner because you're not a man. It's the police captain in Chicago saying that you're not a member of the order because you're not a man. And obviously they kind of dress and look a lot alike too, so that might have something to do with it. But let's not forget that Christina in her own right is manipulating other characters, including Atticus, right? So we saw the gun scene, and in the last episode we talked about that gun scene and the fear that was invoked, the fact that Christina was opening the blinds and exposing Atticus to the fact he lives in an era where his behavior could get him killed, as righteous as it might be. What we didn't examine really is what her purpose was in divulging the plan. She is playing James Bond villain here. I need to get the Book of Names because it has all this power to it. Why would she do that? It's because she wants Atticus to go after it. The entire motivation on this episode appears to be that Atticus needs to get his hands on this book. But really, you got to know that Christina is the one who wants it. She's using him as a tool to get it. And it goes back to episode 2, right? She gave him the ring. She's orchestrating the whole thing. So far, 4 episodes in, every point of the plot, every decision is being driven by Christina Braithwaite.
Well, and the ring, not just in terms of it destroying her father, but also he had to put that ring on his hand when he put his hand in the mouth of truth. I don't know if you've ever been to Rome and you put your hand in the mouth of truth in Rome. Like, that's what it reminded me of. Although nobody gets their arm bitten off in Rome. But he also had to put it on there. So you're dropping this hint to him, go get this. You gave him the ring in order to get it. It just starts to make a lot of sense that she's clearly playing a long game here. And I think that's the point, is we don't really know what her intentions are because she's too smart to tell us. We know she wants the book and we know that she wants it translated, but what for? What is truly her end game? And I don't think we found that out.
And Ash, the arm in the vault happens kind of in the bowels of the museum, right? Just when Atticus and company think that they've solved one part of the mystery, it goes deeper and deeper and deeper, right? It's booby trap after booby trap. Very national treasure, as you mentioned on Lovecraft Live. And it left me wondering for a second, like, why go to Boston? Like, Chicago has plenty of museums. Why would the showrunners make us go all the way back to Boston? And I think it's because they had to highlight Titus Braithwaite, who might not have been a known name, right, in the Chicago area. This is the most powerful part of episode 4 for me, was this revisionist history about Titus Braithwaite in the museum, celebrating the looter and not the people that he looted. And perhaps the most peculiar part of this scene is as Atticus puts his arm into the keyhole and his blood is extracted and this rope ladder drops down, they find themselves in the galley of a ship. And you're wondering why. And I'm like, what is this skeleton dinner party going on? And why are they here? It's very Pirates of the Caribbean. And we discover that they are, in fact, in what appears to be the galley of a ship, referencing Titus Braithwaite's, shipping background as a euphemism. And we're introduced to the Arawak, South American indigenous people of the Caribbean. And we realize in a very direct illustration that on the surface, literally in the world, you have the museum, you have the exploits of Titus Braithwaite, you have the sanitized, beautiful museum, and in the guts of all of it, buried layers and layers and layers deeper, intentionally, right, is this galley of this ship where you have the Arawak, the people he allegedly assisted, but in truth, he exploited.
It's such a literal metaphor, right? That these people are buried away, that their history is buried, because that's what's so horrible about what these explorers in real life and the character of Titus did, is that they completely decimated their history. The fact that they ever existed in the first place, they rendered it irrelevant because they replaced it with something that they considered to be superior, which was, the way of the white man. And I think that that's what's so powerful here, is that you have people who are emaciated and dehydrated, like mummies almost. They're mummified. And that's what you see. When I went to the National Museum of History in Cairo for the first time, that's what like every person looks like in that museum, the people that are mummified. Or if you go to any museum and then you see people like the replicas of them, like that's how they present them. They present them in this defeated way. And so it was so powerful to me that this individual comes back to life, because that's what you're not expecting. You're not expecting for the history to be real and to be alive still, because it's been killed so long ago and has been further killed because of the fact that we don't remember them and we don't even discuss who they were. We discuss where they lived became, because we live there now.
And Ash, there was a degree of self-reflection in the episode too, where Atticus says verbatim, "I'm not guilty of my forefathers' sins, but she does not know my spirit." And by she, he's referring to they, the Arawak Yahima. I loved that dichotomy of the surface story of white savior and explorer versus this underground horror of a people eternally silenced and buried. And you couldn't have done it without the museum as a setting. Getting to the museum, I was surprised that Montrose joined in. We see a scene with him at Denmark Vestes where he clearly seems to be opposed to all this bullshit. And yet we see him go along on the road trip, which surprised me. And it really goes back to the opening of the episode. Now, Ash, you and I are always looking for that voiceover. We've seen it in the previous episodes, and we get it here again, where there's this voiceover of the new global age. It's about nuclear proliferation. And it says, if the United States fails to proliferate its stockpile of nuclear bombs, the barbaric Soviet Union, blah, blah, blah. And I couldn't quite place it. So I did a little bit of research. I talked to some of the listeners. I even went so far as to go to Reddit. In there, I found that one Redditor pointed out it could be a parallel to Montrose's defense being a strong offense. After these voiceovers, we hear a couple other echoes of the past where Montrose physically abused Tick. Montrose also says that foolish and crazy go well together. You know, essentially that Atticus fucking with wizardry is like Letitia's fucking with pioneering on the north side. Montrose burns the order's bylaws to protect his family from falling further down the rabbit hole. So in all of this together, what we are to understand is he is willing to be a nuclear superpower. He is willing to risk ruination in order to stop something that he considers worse from happening.
Well, and it's almost like something that I think a lot of parents do when they feel like they've not been the best parent. And, they try to, be supportive, but they wind up going like way off the rails and going way too far in the other direction. Like, I'm going to protect you now because this is my role as parent. And I think that's what we're seeing here with Montrose. It's like, I'm going to be the parent. I'm going to protect you. And by trying to protect him, not only are you, completely overlooking how this person is feeling and validating their adult feelings about things, you're just making your relationship with them worse. And clearly that's what's happening with Montrose and Tick.
I think the point here is that he realizes no matter what he's doing, Atticus and Leti they're going to keep chasing after this book and this adventure. And so he's going to do the best he can to protect his family, even if that involves going along for the ride. And this part got a little murky for me because I don't know if Montrose is actually enjoying himself. There's a point where, they escape that first booby trap and he says, Jesse Owens ain't got shit on me. And I admittedly smiled, but I'm not sure it made sense. Like, is he kind of into it? Is he not? I think we still have to wait and see where the show takes us on that topic. But the darkest point of this episode, and the part I think that is perhaps the most controversial, is when Montrose kills Yahima, the Arawak. This was painful to see for me as a cisgendered male. It is, I believe, grossly insensitive to entire communities at a time when sexuality and identity are a brave and hurtful subject. And I just wonder, Ash, we talked about this a little bit on Lovecraft Live. Is Lovecraft Country trying to go for the pain, trying to go for the controversy? Are they trying to drive home the point that an other can violently extinguish another other in the name of self-preservation? Or was this just shock value?
This podcast is not for us to express our opinions. We're not critiquing the show in that way. But I will say I personally was highly offended by this storyline for a lot of reasons. And I am going to defer to one of our emails later that actually is a self-identified member of the community that I think that this affects the most. So I will defer to them later on in the podcast to kind of speak for me. But in terms of the question you just posed, I don't know if it was either shock value or intentional in the way that you're saying. I just think it didn't work, whatever their intentions, and I'm sure they were good, whatever their intentions were. This was the part of the episode that worked the least for me, just because how you said, kind of murky earlier with Montrose. This was murky for me because this is taking protection of your kid like real far, right? Like you're going like way down the line. And this poor character, I mean, what a terrible life that they had to lead.
You and I kind of, as much as we ever do, butted heads on Lovecraft Live about this. Upon rewatch, you could make this scene happen, and you could actually have more impact and more respect for the character by just giving it a little more time, right? We saw lots of things in this episode. We've still got 6 episodes to go. It didn't need to be crammed in as kind of a cliffhanger. But again, as we always say, we're 4 episodes into a 10-episode series, and maybe there's more to discover, as we know on a show that has ghosts in it. Going from the murky to the concrete, I did want to talk about Hippolyta in the car. Some people weren't clear as to what was going on here. you're not alone and you're not stupid.
Yeah.
So everybody's back in Chicago through a magic elevator. Somehow Hippolyta is in the car going back to Chicago from Boston. She knows what happened. Apparently, I'm guessing, and they never really explain it, is that I'm guessing she got a phone call from everybody in Chicago. And they're like, hey, by the way, we're in Chicago. And she's like, what the fuck? So she and Dee are in the car. They're headed back to Chicago. That's really not the important part. What is important is what Dee is holding in her hands. She's got the atlas. And Hippolyta notices that the notes in the atlas are in George's writing, and they extend beyond where she was told her husband was slain. And so you see her kind of do a 180, and she's like, we're going to go get some answers, which I love because it gives us another party in the search for truth who might find another truth in this series. It's a subtle hint, but when you go back and you look at it through this lens, you see that she is quite angry with all the bullshit that's going on, and that she, I believe at this point, is detaching from the rest of the group and doing her own thing.
Well, and it gives her some purpose. You know, she's not just George's widow at this point, and I think that that is really interesting. As much as I've said that, like, Montrose is a hard character, and obviously his relationship with Tick is complicated, one thing I really liked that Montrose did this week was this advice he gave Tick about having a love song for your woman. This idea of, like, if you sing it in your head, by the time, you know, they're done freaking out or, you know, fighting with you, that you can get back to what you want to do in the first place, which is lovin'. And I really like that. And it made me go, wow, this is actually pretty great advice. And maybe I'm going to have to create a love song, not just for my spouse, but for, like, my kids when, you know, we're trying to record right now. And I'm sure Gene will cut it all out. But Finn has been, my son has been in and out, playing with cars, trying to make us listen to Power Rangers. Like, I need to sing a love song for my kid, you know, so that I don't get frustrated. And he just kicked me in the face. And so I think that this is a really fantastic idea, and probably is the most charming and actually helpful that Montrose has been. And, like, you know, cue the alert here to Montrose. You don't have to murder the indigenous people. You can just keep having really great advice like this to, you know, to bond with your kid.
I agree, Ash. This moment touched me as I was watching the show. It was one of those moments of TV where I paused and went, God damn, that is really, really good advice. Guys, gals, if you're ever having an issue with your spouse, person you love, the person you just happen to be fucking that week, have a love song for your woman, your man, your two-spirit, whoever it might be. Just have that love song, sing it to yourself, and when that song is over, everything's going to be okay. I love it. Another thing I loved about this episode was the reference to NACA. One thing we've learned about Lovecraft Country is it will drop Easter egg after Easter egg in front of you. And in this episode, we get Hippolyta referencing NACA. And if you are unfamiliar with it, as I was, this is the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics that started out in 1935. It was a precursor to NASA. And it hired hundreds of women as computers. So if you remember Hidden Figures, the famous Hollywood movie, it was about NACA. Cool little reference. It is sort of the purpose of Lovecraft Country to give us little history lessons as we go along.
Well, and one thing we learned about Christina's history is that she's never played hide and seek before, which I thought was super strange. And also, I found that scene, like, super creepy. Like, why are you hanging out in the middle of the street playing hide and seek? Like, really shitty hide and seek. You're hiding behind a fucking tree and they can see you. Like, you know, I thought that was such a strange little scene. And I like William's portrayal. I'm not quite getting Christina's portrayal quite yet. But just random.
Yeah, I don't think it's just Christina Braithwaite who's never played hide and seek. I don't think Abby Lee has ever played hide and seek, the actress who plays Christina Braithwaite. Because I'm like, I think what it was meant to show us is the dichotomy between black neighborhoods and white neighborhoods.
But it was weird.
But it was just weird. She's this lanky motherfucker with, like, these high-waisted pants. And I was like, yeah, this is literally a scene that we could have just cut and had the cops pick her up literally anywhere and take her to the Chicago Lodge. One fascinating byproduct of this show, and I don't know if it's intentional, and it might just be me on this, but I watch very little TV, and the TV that I do watch is, now that I think about it, a lot of white people on TV, right? Game of Thrones, think about Westworld, you think about Perry Mason, which Ash got me into and I absolutely love. White people, white people. This show has mostly Black people, and it is different seeing so few white faces on screen. And I think in episode 4, if you watch it, it is a very shaded episode. It's very dark in the way that it's shot. There's not a ton of lighting. And the white people in Lovecraft Country look like outsiders. And if this is an intentional thing, super cool. If it's an unintentional thing, even cooler, I think. I'm being reconditioned to see white actors as the other, and it's fascinating. And that brings us to our voicemail for the episode. Now, we have a couple of people who've called in before and a few new callers. And our first voicemail comes from Tawana in Bermuda, a repeat caller.
Good morning. This is Tawana Tanik from Bermuda. I will be brief as my last voicemail got cut off in gravity. Well, I struggle with gravity. So long story short, just managed to watch the third episode last evening. Glad I saved it. It just packed a lot of a punch into a haunted house trope. And it by far was my favorite episode. And I think it really illustrated the otherness of Leti and this concept of the tragic mulatto. And of course, Jordan Peele is mixed race. I don't know Misha Greenwood's story. But I think we have talked a lot and we talk a lot about the sense of otherness, but this episode illustrated how Leti is in fact an other, how she takes in her artist collective. We hear a reference to James Baldwin when the gentleman with the racket, I believe, or is moving into the house, which I think is supposed to give us an indication of perhaps his sexuality. And even just this sense that if the mom did leave money, that Leti would not question it, the fact that the mom had left it solely to her. The estate agent would not question that she left it solely to her, or even without the Braithwaites greasing the wheels, that she could buy this house, because there would have been certain things that would have been easier to accept because of her color, because then, as now, colorism in the Black community, perhaps even more so then, was really, really a heightened issue. And so I think it's interesting that she's also viewed as this commodity in the party. In particular, we can see this, that these men are looking at her as this other, right? This unique butterfly, and that it's really just a facade. This, her dressing and her language, when in actual fact she's a virgin. And I think that, when we see her crying afterwards, she realizes that, she has now fallen into what she did not want to be. She did not want to be this stereotype. She did not want to be this trope. And we also see that our hero Atticus is flawed. So I think this episode was really, really interesting because in addition to contrasting the external horrors outside the house of racism and the neighbors, you also have the internal conflict going on inside of the house with the ghost, but you also have the internal conflict going on inside of Leti's family and then also with her community at large. And I'm really interested to see how colorism is handled going forward in this and how this is addressed in the rest of the season. So keep up the good work, guys. And take care.
I think that what Tawana's talking about here is really interesting. It's actually something you and I have talked about, Jean, off air, which is that I think it's very intentional, the fact that Ruby and Letitia are so different in terms of complexion, that Letitia is very, very fair-skinned and Ruby is not. And I think that there's going to have to be some addressing of that at some point. I think they're setting it up for that tension potentially between the two of them, because Leti is so fair-skinned. I mean, they could even introduce the idea of passing. And, if nobody's read it, I mean, there's some fantastic text I'll post on Twitter that I have my students read about passing and the phenomenon of passing and what that meant in terms of social complexities in this time period. And so I think that that's going to be something that comes up and that is addressed. And I think Tawana's spot on that this idea of the issue of color, even within the Black community that's being shown here, is going to come up at some point in this season.
Thank you, Tawana, for your voicemail. Our next voicemail is also about Letitia.
Hi. I've been enjoying your podcast on Lovecraft Country. Haven't read the book, but I have been loving the series and loving your comments. I'm a series ahead of you, but just one thought may not be noteworthy to you, but looking at Letitia, and I'm wondering if looking at her becoming perhaps more of the primary protagonist of the story, putting together some pieces, our introduction to her as Ruby's sister, struck by the similarities in their appearance, juxtaposed with Samuel Braithwaite's comments on Tick not looking exactly like he thought. She becomes the aggressive hero figure in their travels. She's comfortable with the estate life, ringing the bell for the salt. Then moving to episode 3, all of a sudden she gets money that Ruby was confounded by from her mother to buy the house. And then later in that episode, Ruby mentions that she's just like her father, which I don't recall any background story on. So I'm just looking at this series as sort of turning some things upside down, and I'm looking at Letitia perhaps coming out as a much more interesting, complex figure, and perhaps more of the primary protagonist in the story. Didn't know what your thoughts would be, but regardless, thank you for the opportunity, and I'll continue to listen. It's enjoyable and entertaining. Thanks a lot.
In this episode, we get Letitia delivering this great line to Atticus, which we mentioned in Lovecraft Live on Sunday night, which is essentially that the universe doesn't revolve around him, right? He's trying to get her into the elevator and get her out of the scene while he goes on the adventure and completes the task. And she's like, no, like this isn't just about you. And the show might be sort of hinting to us that she is the bigger figure in all this. And getting back to what Tawana was saying, as well, she has the increased mobility. She is seen as something different, almost otherworldly. And it would be interesting if she was positioned as the protagonist in all this, as we see Lovecraft Country taking a very progressive view of all characters. And next we have a follow-up voicemail from Jeff in Alaska.
Oh, so much for me getting included on any podcast this week. This is Jeff in Alaska, and I'm going to follow up on my preemptive strike there. Not only did I not get the anachronisms, am I saying that right? Anachronism? I don't freaking know, but whatever it is, I didn't get it right. And I'm glad about that because they were driving me nuts. Great music. That whole episode was fantastic. I would give it half a wipe because you can have a 0 wipe, but you still got to get down there and dab and check to make sure. So nothing's 0 wipe. It's always at least half a wipe. And that's what that was. That was just brilliant. Can't wait to watch it again. Can't wait for the podcast. Thank you guys for everything. I seriously do love you guys. I've been listening for years and years and years since you started doing Game of Thrones. And I will continue to wield the Shat colors. Bless you. Bye.
What are the Shat colors?
Gosh, that's a very, very good question. I mean, one would assume brown. By the way, if people are wondering what the hell Jeff is talking about with wipe scores, if you're from Shat on TV and you've never listened to Shat the movies, our wipe scores are a way of telling you how many wipes a movie would take to get off your bum. So 0 wipes is a perfect movie. 5 wipes is an absolute disaster. And we've never given any movie 5 wipes. We have given some movies 0 wipes. I don't think we've ever given a TV episode 0 wipes. I've yet to see that. But I agree with all of the callers this week that episode 3 is the pinnacle so far of what we've seen on Lovecraft Country.
And I just want to put out there that Battle of the Bastards, Game of Thrones season 6 was a 0 wipe episode, as was the season finale. So they exist, Gene.
I would say it's at least a half a wipe because why in the world were they waiting so long to help John out? They're just like, let's wait a little while, make it a surprise, whatever. If you're Sansa, you should be like, help him out. Spoiler alert.
For another day, Gene.
All right. Thanks, Jeff, for your voicemail. And we have one email this week that was highlighted by Ash earlier in the episode.
This is, hi, y'all. Longtime listener, first-time caller. I just had to drop a quick few lines about the character of Yahima Marakoti, the two-spirit person in prison by Titus. I was uncomfortable with the full frontal reveal of her body. It's voyeuristic and a bad callback to the crying game. I fully expected them to turn to dust when our heroes grabbed the rolled up pages. They seemed to be trapped by the magic, and at the end of their conversation with Tick, they returned to sitting with their hand resting on the pages. When they didn't and actually escaped with the others, I cheered. There have been so few characters that I, a Latina trans woman, could see myself in. I was excited about the possibility of this two-spirit character hanging around for the rest of the series. When they took her voice away, I thought this was just a way to minimize their involvement in future plots. Then they were brutally killed on screen. I literally broke down crying. I understand from a plot view, having a character who can give the main characters all the answers is a problem, but there was no guarantee they would tell them everything or anything at all. Their death was senseless, and another in a long line of characters dying for other characters' stories. By some strange bit of luck, your live show was just about to start after I finished the episode. It was a great help to be with other fans right after seeing that. Thank you for that. Gillian Y. P.S. And she included here the link to an interview with the actress that includes a full translation of the dialogue. When this gets posted on the website, we'll make sure to include that because I went to it and it's actually pretty interesting. And let me just say, I appreciated you very much on Twitch expressing your opinions about this because, I mean, I can say that something's offensive, but I'm not a member of the community that potentially is offended by this, right? Like I'm offended as a human and that it's happening to another human, but I think it's so much more powerful when we have a voice from that community that potentially could be harmed by a scene like this. And I have to say, this is what I feared upon watching this scene because I think that, and I am repeating myself, I apologize to the 40 of you that were on our instant Twitch because I did say this then, but I think that pop culture teaches us how to treat the people around us. It teaches us how to treat other groups. And if you watch, how people of color were portrayed in early Hollywood, if you watch, just the portrayal of, for example, Mamie in Gone with the Wind, like that taught us what people of color were supposed to be in the station that they supposedly were supposed to have in our life as white people walking through this world. And it's not okay. And it caused lots of violence that would happen along the way. And I think the trans community is a severe victim of this. And we do know that the spirit is a two-spirit, right? So they're walking into worlds. It's potentially a third gender. They're drawing on all of these legends and beliefs and indigenous and aboriginal cultures, but a lot of people are going to watch this and assume trans because of the fact that the individual, the character had, the breast of a woman and had, the genitalia of a cisgendered male, right? Somebody that is born male. And so I think that when people assume they're trans, when it's obvious that they're making a reference to that, the brutal slaughter of them when every day people of color that are trans are dying all around us and their murders are going without any coverage and without any justice because they're seen as second-class citizens, I think it can become very irresponsible for a show to take that lightly. And if it was for shock value, I don't necessarily think that worked. And I think it certainly harms people like our wonderful listener here. I'm sure we'll get a 1-star review for this now being too political and for us being social justice warriors, but that's okay. Because I think that if you read any critics' reviews, this is the biggest thing that they're questioning from this week is the intentionality and the success or lack of success for this character and scene.
And before you hit us with that 1-star review, one piece of advice I got years ago as a journalist was we all have a tendency, Ash, you and I in particular, as people who consider ourselves academics or people who are well-read on subjects, which is to argue points as an academic. And one thing you have to understand is if you are the academic and you're having the discussion with the person who is personally affected by it, you may not be in the right discussing it in an academic way. It's easy to discuss it as an academic when it doesn't affect you. Then it becomes objective. Then it becomes fact, as opposed to feeling. And it's really, really important to, rather than detach yourself from it as like as an academic, which is the tendency to actually attach yourself to the feelings that are being expressed by the other person, right? In this case, I'm so glad to have so much representation in our Twitch audience and in our voicemail and email audience so that we can hear, with regard to Yahima, the character, they were twice wronged in this episode. And I hope that's clear to everybody. Montrose was the obvious one, but go back to Titus. Titus saw this being as something supernatural, something with some power that might help him in his endeavors. And so there was exploitation and execution in one episode. And I think this what made it particularly painful for a lot of people.
Yeah, I mean, they could have just disappeared, right? They could have dissolved into dust. They could have never gotten the elevator. There's so many ways for the character to die without it being quite so violent, right? Like, I mean, I think that the history of violence there maybe was a bit too multi-layered, I think, for some people. That's all. But maybe we'll find out next week. Maybe some big reveal will explain why it happened. I mean, like you said, we're 4 episodes into a 10-episode series, but I really appreciate you guys writing in and giving us perspective that we can't have, not being members of the groups that, are affected the most by portrayals like this. So
if Lovecraft Country gives us nothing else, it gives us endless topics to discuss and endless eye-opening experiences. So thanks everybody for writing in and calling in. And that concludes this week's episode of Shat on TV Lovecraft Country. We hope you enjoyed, and we'll join us next week for more. Be sure to follow us on social media and share with a friend. Be sure to follow us on social media and share with a friend. We're on Twitter, Snapchat, and Instagram at Shat on TV. On Facebook, just search for Shat on TV Podcasts. The website is shatontv.com. If you like to write in with your thoughts on this episode, on the podcast overall or the series overall, just write host at shatontv.com. The phone number for voicemail, which we love to receive, is 914-719-SHAT. And again, if you didn't hear your voicemail or your email on this deep dive, remember that we do have our Shappy Hour every Friday at 9 p.m. Eastern. We do save some email and voicemail for that. It's our cocktail party at the end of the year. We're doing Moscow.
The end of the year. Ooh, I wish it were.
That too. It's our cocktail party at the end of the week. We'll be doing Moscow Mules this week. So please join us. We'll get to some more email and voicemail there and have a couple of drinks along the way. That's all on Twitch at www.shatontv.com/Twitch, where you can see our entire Twitch schedule. And tonight, Wednesday night, we will be playing Jackbox games. So join us tonight at 9:30 Eastern for Jackbox games. You don't need a gaming console. You can just use your smartphone and computer. Wherever fine podcasts can be found, including iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, Pandora, Spotify, and YouTube. Be sure to subscribe. And if you stop by iTunes, be sure to leave a 5-star review. That helps the podcast grow. On behalf of my co-hosts, Ashley Schlafly, the King Bee, and Big D, Dick Ebert, I'm Gene Lyons. Please join us on Friday night for our Shappy Hour. Have a great week and stay safe.
And as always, stay the fuck at home.